Okay. So, John's Gospel, chapter 21, verse 1 to 19. Afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples were together. "I'm going out to fish," Simon Peter told them, and they said, "We'll go with you." So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in a boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from the shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it, and some bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you've just caught." So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said. "You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." Just pray for Kevin as he comes up to speak. My God, thank you so much for this day. We thank you for bringing us from wherever we are to come and just listen to your word, to praise and worship you now. I just ask you that you'll just speak through Kevin as he comes up now. Help him to just relay the words he wants us to hear, Lord. Let these words encourage us and help us to encourage each other throughout this week with what we've learned. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Good morning. If you could keep your Bibles open there to John 21. Sorry, it's a problem when you're tall. We'll be looking at this passage here this morning. Let me just pray one more time for the Lord's help. Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you that it is living and active. And Lord, we pray that you would work in us, work in our hearts, strengthen our faith, and give faith where there is not yet faith. This morning we pray. Amen. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands on this one, but who here is a failure? There's no need for me to ask for a show of hands on that, is there? Because I think if we're honest, we all know the answer to that question, don't we? We all are. We all are failures. We all wrestle with failures. Each one of us is currently dealing maybe with a failure in the past we're still trying to get over, or with a current failure that we're wrestling with, or maybe we're anxious about the possibility of future failures. And our battle with failure begins early, in our earliest years, with school and with sport and with failing to live up to our parents' expectations. And as we get older, we then deal with failures in our personal lives and our professional lives and our friendships and our relationships, in our marriages, in our parenting. Failure is such a painful reality for us, isn't it? Because it strikes at our self-worth. So much of our self-worth or our identity is bound up in some of these things. And when we fail a test, or a relationship crumbles, or someone else gets the job, every time it feels like another hammer blow on our identity, on our self-worth, like cracks of shame just splitting through our identity. But beyond all of these things, beyond professional or academic failures, and those hurt, but they may or may not be our fault in many cases, beyond this is the even more painful reality of moral failures that we have, especially areas where we repeat the same failures over and over and over again. We lash out in anger again. We give in to the temptation again. We fail to stand up for someone again. We break a promise we made to ourselves again. These are the kinds of failures that we want to talk specifically about this morning. And perhaps for some here this morning, these failures are fresh and raw. They happened this morning, or last night, or this week. Maybe for others of us, the most haunting failures we feel are historical. Maybe something not that's repeated or recent, but something in the past. Something irredeemable, unforgivable. A historical horror that's just still stretching its shadow forward until today. And as we deal with these failures, we deal with a combination of shame over what we have done and fear that we will do it again, don't we? So let me ask you this morning, do failures deserve a second chance? How about a third? How about a fourth? How about a 10th? How about a 100th? Our justice systems tend to increase punishments for repeat offenders, don't they? People who make the same mistakes over and over again. Does God function the same way when we are repeat offenders against him over and over and over? Friends, what do we do when we fail? Where do we go with our shame? Where do we go with our guilt? Well, if you're looking for exhibit A of failure, look no further than the Apostle Peter. Peter the brave, Peter the bold, Peter the courageous, Peter the I will lay down my life for you, Jesus. Peter the coward, Peter the weak, Peter the spineless, Peter the I don't know this man. And as we enter the last chapter of the book of John, Peter and his failure is the elephant in the room. And John 21 can be a bit of a confusing chapter because if you were here 2 weeks ago when Bryce preached from the end of John 20, it really felt like the book had reached its climax, and we should probably end right there. Do you remember the last couple verses of chapter 20? Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. What better way could you end the book than that? I mean, what more is there to say after saying something like that? But John does have more to say. Just like he began the book with a prologue, the first part of chapter 1, he ends with an epilogue. The main action is over, but he still has some questions to answer and some threads that he needs to tie off. And we're used to this from movies, aren't we? Even after the big climax, after the huge battle is done, even after Sauron or Thanos or Voldemort or the White Witch or Emperor Palpatine or the Joker or whoever the bad guy is at that moment, even after they are dead or locked up, we still want to know what happens to the heroes, what happens to the characters that we care about. And this is what John is doing for us here. He still has questions to answer, like, how will the disciples relate to this new resurrected Jesus? And he still has threads to tie off, like Peter, the story of Peter. I mean, Peter is meant to be leading these disciples, and his last move was a colossal failure. So in closing off Peter's story here in this chapter, John touches on something we can all relate to, this painful issue of personal, moral failure. We all fail over and over again, so much so that we feel trapped often in these patterns of failure, and we begin to lose confidence in God's love for us and lose hope in our ability to be loved by God and even to be used by him. But John wants to give failures like us hope. Hope that our lives can still bring glory to God, and God can still do good to those around us, through us. And so John gives us this epilogue to teach us a few lessons about the risen Lord and his relationship with his disciples. We're going to look at 2 of those lessons this morning and then a few more next week. So let's move into the narrative here to find the first lesson that John wants us to learn. In verse 1, we see that Jesus appeared again to his disciples, the 3rd time after his resurrection. And I think sometimes we maybe have the assumption that Jesus kind of just hung out with his disciples after his resurrection, but that's not really the case. Jesus revealed himself from time to time when he chose, and not always in the same way. Sometimes it seems like they recognized him immediately, other times not. There's some sort of mystery here with his resurrection body. There's continuity because he still has the same scars. He can show them to Thomas in the last chapter, but there's discontinuity here as well. Something is different, as we're going to see in this chapter. Notice also that the disciples have left Jerusalem and returned to Galilee, where they are from. We saw that in verse 1 here. They're back at home at the Sea of Galilee. In verses 2 to 3, we see that 7 of the 11 remaining disciples, obviously Judas has killed himself at this point, but 7 of the 11 remaining disciples are together in Galilee. And Simon Peter decides he's going fishing, and the other disciples decide to come along with him. Now, the fact that the disciples are going fishing is a little strange, isn't it? I mean, back when Jesus appeared to his disciples for the first time, he told them that he was sending them out as the Father had sent him, and he promised to give them his Spirit. But here the disciples are fishing again. And some people would say the disciples are being disobedient here. Others would say, no, I think they're just confused about what they are to be doing. And I think confusion is more likely here. Jesus promised to give them his Spirit, but the actual coming of the Spirit didn't happen until Pentecost, Acts 2. And once the Spirit comes in Acts 2, it's very hard to imagine the disciples going fishing at that point. They are quite literally men on a mission from that point on. But here, they're still lacking the indwelling power of the Spirit. And I think that they are genuinely confused about what they are supposed to be doing. Whatever their motivations, they fish all night and they catch nothing, right? And then in verses 4 through 6, Jesus arrives at the scene early in the morning and stands there on the shore, and the disciples, we're told, don't know who he is. And Jesus calls out to them, lads, have you caught any fish? No, we haven't. And Jesus provides not an educated guess, but a miraculous direction. Throw your nets on the right side and you will find fish. And to their surprise, the net is so full that they can't even haul it in. Now in verses 7 through 8, John, who is always the sharper one, recognizes that it is Jesus, and he tells Peter. And then Peter, who is always the man of action, just throws himself out of the boat and starts swimming to Jesus. And I just love picturing the rest of the disciples at this point. I mean, the scene is amazing, right? They go from, wow, look at all these fish, to, hey, it's Jesus, to, where did Peter go, to, did someone fall out of the boat? Man overboard. Like, Peter is just such an impulsive person. And then they realize Peter's bailed on them, and they're like, hey, Peter, thanks for helping with all these fish, man. Like, we're trying to get these fish back to shore, and Peter's just floundering his way back to shore on his own. So Peter swims, and the rest of the disciples, like the responsible men that they are, bring the fish back to shore with the boat. So in verses 9 through 14, the disciples arrive at the shore, some wetter than others, and find that a charcoal fire is burning there. Now, John is triggering our memories here. Does anyone remember the last time we saw a charcoal fire in the book of John? It was the night Jesus was betrayed. As Jesus was standing before the high priest, and Peter stood outside in front of a charcoal fire, warming himself, and betrayed Jesus 3 times. And John brings us back to that event by mentioning the charcoal fire to tip us off something related is about to happen here. So in verse 10, Jesus asks them to bring some of the fish that they caught, and Peter, the superhero, again jumps aboard, and it would appear single-handedly drags that net to shore. Now, maybe I'm reading into this, but I see here a man who is working to do absolutely anything he can to restore himself to his Lord. He knows how much he has failed, and he is doing his level best to prove his loyalty to Jesus. In verse 12, Jesus invites the disciples to eat breakfast. And you can just smell it, can't you? The fish and the bread cooking on a fire. And these men have worked all night long and caught nothing. They are hungry, and yet, what do? They don't eat. You see what John says in verse 12 there? None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. This is weird. They are standing right next to Jesus. They know it's him, and yet they're afraid to ask him who he is? How does that even make sense? Something is different about this risen Jesus. He looks different. And here's what we need to see. In this moment, they are not recognizing him by sight, but by what he is doing. They're recognizing him based on his actions. We'll come back to that in a moment. So in verse 13, Jesus takes the fish and the bread and he just feeds it to them because they're too afraid to come receive it themselves. Now, let's pause here to identify the first lesson that John is showing us here. Remember, we said earlier that the disciples are trying to figure out how do we relate to this new resurrected Jesus. And this is a very poor analogy, but think of how in every superhero origin story, all the people around them have to figure out, how do I relate to this new person with their new powers that they have? Very poor analogy, but I think it captures a small bit of what's going on here. That Jesus is different. And the disciples are trying to figure out, how do we relate to this different resurrected Jesus? What is this Jesus teaching these disciples about how he's going to relate to them? Well, notice with me, what do the disciples do in this passage? They're confused. They don't know what to do. When they do something, they fail at it. Actually, until Jesus steps in, the disciples do a whole lot of nothing in this passage. What about Jesus? What does Jesus do in this passage? He tells them where to cast the net. He provides and prepares a meal for them. He invites them to eat. When they're too afraid to come, he physically serves them what he has prepared. Do you see the contrast? Here is Jesus' first lesson for his disciples post-resurrection. In your need, I will still serve and help you. Now you might be thinking, okay, obvious, Kevin. Do you remember John 15? Apart from me, you can do nothing. Haven't we seen this over and over in John? Exactly. But now we're seeing it after the resurrection as well. What was one of the last things Jesus did before his death? He served his disciples by washing their feet. Now, what does the risen Christ do? He serves his disciples by feeding them, by providing for them. The disciples may not be able to recognize this Jesus by sight at this moment, but they know him by his actions. He is still serving them, still providing for them, still helping them. And that corrects two misconceptions that it's easy for us to slip into. First, it shows us that Jesus didn't finish his part and then leave us to do ours. No, we still can do nothing apart from him. We're still needy, still weak, and he is still the same servant to us, serving us and helping us in our need. In this post-resurrection world, as we follow his commission, he still serves us, still provides for us. But secondly, it also shows us that Jesus didn't finish his ministry and then pass the torch off to the Holy Spirit. I'm done, your turn. Yes, Jesus did send the Spirit after he returned to heaven, but Jesus himself ministers to us through his Spirit. Ephesians 3 tells us that God strengthens us through his Spirit so that Christ can dwell in our hearts through faith. And the point here is not to pit Jesus and the Spirit against each other, of course, but the opposite, to emphasize that the Spirit who helps us is the Spirit of Christ who helps us. That Jesus, who we love in the Gospels, the one who loves sinners, who cares for the weak and marginalized, who is tender and gentle and lowly, and yet victorious and awesome and powerful, he is the same Jesus for us today. Think of how Ephesians 5 describes Jesus as the one who nourishes his church. Nourishes, meaning he feeds his church, right? Jesus continues to feed his church today. So the first lesson that Jesus is teaching his disciples here after the resurrection is this: in your need, I will still serve and help you. Now let's turn to the second section and look for Jesus' second lesson. In verse 15, the disciples finish eating breakfast, and now Jesus turns his attention specifically on Peter. Peter the failure. Peter the one desperately trying to earn his way back and to earn Jesus' trust once more. And it seems like this exchange between Peter and Jesus happens in front of the other disciples. And this is important because Peter has failed publicly and needs to be restored publicly as well. And the conversation here hinges on this threefold question and response, which, of course, mirrors that triple denial which also happened in front of a charcoal fire back in chapter 18. In verse 15, Jesus asks Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" Now that question requires a bit of interpretation. Jesus could be saying, "Do you love me or the disciples more?" Or he could be saying, "Do you love me or your cool fishing gear more?" Neither of these make a lot of sense in the context. Instead, I think what Jesus is asking Peter is, "Peter, do you love me more than these other men do?" Remember, Peter has always been so quick to affirm his love. "I will lay down my life for you." And actually, in Matthew's account, in chapter 26, he says, "Even if all fall away on account of you," all these rookies over here, tier 2 disciples, "even if they fall away, I never will." So up until this point, Peter has been convinced he is the disciple par excellence. But when the real pressure came, he caved, utterly and completely. And Jesus comes and looks Peter right in the eyes and shatters his pride completely. "Peter, do you love me more than these other disciples do?" Now Peter's learning. He responds by affirming that he does love Jesus, which is true, but not in some kind of super apostle way. "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus responds with a command: "Feed my lambs." We'll come back to that in a minute. And then the same thing happens a second time. "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." "Take care of my sheep," a similar command. And then in verse 17, the third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And now things click for Peter, and he realizes what Jesus is doing and why he's doing this 3 times, and he's grieved. And he responds with an even better answer this time. Instead of simply affirming his love, relying on his own assurance of his love, he defers to Jesus even more strongly in this moment. Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Peter has been humbled. He is finally relying on Jesus' knowledge of his heart rather than his own assurances of his loyalty or his own efforts to earn his way back to Jesus. And Jesus responds the third time in a similar way, feed my sheep. Again, we'll come back to that. But then he takes the conversation in an unexpected direction. Look back at verse 18. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted, but when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Okay, Jesus commissions Peter to care for his sheep, and then he pivots, and he makes this statement, which kind of sounds a bit like a proverb, doesn't it? When you're young, you can do what you want. When you're old, you'll be forced to do what other people want. Now, left to our own devices, we might be a little confused on, okay, where's Jesus going with this? But John interpreted it for us there in verse 19, didn't he? Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. To stretch out your hands is a way of speaking about being crucified. And if you're crucified, you're being led where you don't want to go. Jesus is signifying to Peter by what way he will die. He will be crucified for Jesus. And John, the author, knows this is the case because by the time he wrote this gospel, near the end of his life, Peter had been crucified for Christ, probably under the Roman Emperor Nero and his persecution. Do you see what's happening in this moment? Jesus takes this failure of a man who claimed back in chapter 12 that he would die for him and then denied 3 times that he even knew him. And he assures this man that by the grace of God, he will be true to his promise. Peter will have another chance to demonstrate his love for Jesus by dying for him. He's not lost. He will die for Christ. And in doing so, he will glorify God. Did you see that there in verse 19? The way that he would glorify God through his death. Jesus gives Peter another chance and assures him that he will not fail in the end. And then he finishes in verse 20 by issuing the same call he's been making to his disciples all along. Follow me. The content hasn't changed for Peter. The calling hasn't been updated, but hope has been rekindled in Peter's heart. Failure will not be the final word in his life. So what's the second lesson we learn here from Jesus in these interactions with Peter? In your failure, I will still restore and use you. We began this morning by speaking of how we fail over and over, so much so that we often feel trapped in these patterns of failure, and we lose hope in our ability to please God or to be used by him. We asked, should failures be given a second chance or a fourth or a 10th? We asked, where should we go with our shame for our failures? And the answer is that failures should go to Jesus. Because Jesus isn't scared off by your failures. In fact, Jesus came for failures like Peter and like you and like me. Jesus doesn't need your perfection because he possesses in himself all the perfection necessary to please God on your behalf. Jesus accepts us, failures and all. So if you are here today wrestling with your failure, maybe a shadow from your past that's hanging over you, or an ongoing battle with failure, there's hope for you because failures are welcome to follow this King. But there's a process for you to follow. There's a process for us to follow if we are going to find restoration from Jesus in our failures. Jesus does not say, no bother, and sweep our failures under the rug. No, he provides a roadmap for us here to follow as we seek his restoration in our failures. We're not talking here about earning our way back into his good books. That's not what I'm talking about. But we're talking about what is the path to restoration that Jesus has laid out for us in our failures. And I'm sure that we could find more than this, but I see at least 5 components here in this passage. And rather than thinking of these as sequential steps, think of them as 5 ingredients that come together to show what true restoration from our failures will involve. The first ingredient is humbling. The kingdom of God has room for only one hero, and it's not you, and it's not me. It's Jesus. And if we are to experience the restoration that Jesus offers sinners, the first step, maybe the hardest step, is to look our failures in the eyes. Again, we're not talking here about, failures in your job or something. We're talking about moral failures like Peter. To look those failures in the eye and acknowledge they are a big deal. Sin is nothing less than cosmic treason against the Lord of the universe. And depending on our personalities, maybe some of us, the natural response to sin and failure is to just brush it off as no big deal. Maybe for others of us, it's to wallow in it hopelessly. But neither apathy nor hopelessness is the path to restoration, but humbling is. The second ingredient for restoration from our failures is depending. Peter must submit to Jesus' perspective on things rather than his own. He must learn to defer to Jesus, to acknowledge Jesus, to stop trying to fix the issue himself, but to depend on Jesus as the only one who can raise him back up. Lord, you know all things. Maybe some of you know the famous line from Batman Begins. Why do we fall, Bruce? So we can learn to pick ourselves up. There's some good parenting advice there, but not great theology. When we fail, we need to learn that Jesus picks us up. We submit to him and his perspective, and we depend on him instead of trying to fix things ourselves. The third ingredient is reorienting. For Peter, everything up until this point has been about himself, what he can do, his loyalty, and then his failures, and then his attempts to try to solve the problem himself. But in verse 19, Jesus reorients Peter's life around the true center of the universe, the glory of God. This is what we were made for, not for ourselves. And God is so committed to his own glory that he will mercifully restore failures so that they can then go out and live lives that glorify God. So restoration requires for us reorienting our lives back around the glory of God instead of around ourselves. Fourth, Jesus invites failures again towards following. We saw that in verse 19. The call for failures is not towards earning or leading or atoning or repaying. The call for failures is still the same. It always has been. We get back in line following our Lord, following the one whose perfection has redeemed us. Peter needs to learn that before he ever will lead the other disciples, he must orient his life around following Jesus. And then finally, Jesus calls Peter, and he calls failures like us, towards serving. Did you notice how Jesus' response to Peter's failures is not, don't do that again? His response is commissioning Peter to serve. Feed my lambs. Take care of my sheep. Feed my sheep. Now, obviously, there's a uniqueness to Peter's commission here. The church has been uniquely fed by Peter and the other apostles, and we continue to be fed uniquely by our pastors, right? God's under-shepherds. And we praise God for how well we are fed and cared for at DBC. But for all of us, part of the restoration process from failure involves learning to serve others instead of ourselves. And here, Jesus highlights that true love for him always expresses itself in serving others in the church, feeding each other, caring for each other's needs in the church. And isn't this such an important part of moving past our own failures? To know that no matter how many times we have failed in this life, God still desires to use us for the good of other people. So perhaps when we fail, we should take our cues from Jesus here. And instead of just thinking about how can I not do that thing again, perhaps rather we should think about how can we do good to others, especially in a way that actively works against that specific area of failure. What do I mean by that? If you continue to fail with gossiping, instead of just trying to stop gossiping, look for ways to speak good of other people, right? If you battle with laziness, instead of saying, I just don't want to be lazy, look for ways to serve other people. If you battle with lust, which really is to objectify other people, look for ways to honor men and women as image bearers, not objects of lust, but image bearers of God to be served. We haven't really made our way through this process of restoration until we have been recommissioned by Jesus to serve others in the church. Now, there's lots more that could be said here, but we see here at least 5 ingredients that Jesus provides to restore us as we restore us from our failures: humbling, depending, reorienting, following, and serving. 5 steps. Again, not steps, 5 ingredients put together that are a pathway Jesus gives us. Now, you may be listening to this wondering, well, how does all this talk about hope for failures fit with the need to grow in holiness, and how faith without works is dead, and how maybe if I'm repeatedly failing, it shows I'm not saved? Well, we need that balance theologically, don't we? Those things are true, and we teach those things here. But we want to listen to the heartbeat of each individual passage. And in this passage, the emphasis is on the fact that Jesus provides hope for failures. What Jesus is teaching us here after his resurrection is this: in your need, I will still serve and help you. In your failure, I will still restore and use you. Friends, it is safe for us to come to Jesus with our failures because the tomb is empty. Remember, as we talked about a few weeks ago, the resurrection is God's statement that the penalty we owe for sin, which is death, has been paid in full. Sin and death no longer have a claim on Jesus, and they no longer have a claim on those who have trusted in him. Maybe you're here this morning and you haven't trusted in Jesus. And if that's you this morning, I need to break it to you that the first step in coming to Jesus is humbling yourself and admitting that all of us, you included, are failures. We all have to duck under that same low, humbling doorway if we are to follow Jesus. But friend, where else would you go with your failures? To the world? Have you seen social media? There's no redemption for failures there. Come to Jesus, the perfect one, who gave up his life as a perfect sacrifice for your sin, and now invites you, failures and all, to follow him. Let's pray. Lord, we look to you in our failures, and we praise you for Jesus, whose perfection is more than enough to cover for us. Lord, would you help us to come to you, to humble ourselves, and to look to you for help, even in the midst of our struggles. In Christ's name, amen.